There was a time when a glowing blue globe meant the world was getting smaller, faster, richer. On the night of December 4th, 1991, that light went out. It happens quietly, almost politely. In New York, Miami, Frankfurt, late-night terminals hum under fluorescent fatigue. Departure boards still whisper, "Pan Am," in flickering green. But at the counters, the computers are shutting down for the last time. Agents who spent their whole working life in that blue and white uniform print final boarding passes with shaking hands. Some are crying. Some stare straight ahead, as if holding eye contact with passengers might make the whole story too real. In one corner, a manager tapes a sheet of paper over the Pan Am logo. Flight canceled. Airline ceased operations. No ceremony, no grand farewell tour, just a memo from a bankruptcy judge and a few airport cops waiting to lock the doors. An empire that once stretched across oceans is being dismantled with office stationery, because this is not just another company going under. For more than 60 years, Pan American World Airways was more than an airline. It was the unofficial flag of the United States painted on aluminum. Its planes carried diplomats and movie stars, soldiers and CEOs. Its executives sat with presidents, whispered with dictators, and walked into Boeing's offices to demand aircraft that didn't even exist yet. Pan Am didn't just fly routes. It drew the first global air map and then taught the world to read it. So when those counters go dark, it feels less like a business failure and more like a state funeral. The end of a particular kind of American power, the era when a ticket with that blue globe promised glamour, security, and a seat in the front row of globalization. An age written in jet fuel, champagne, and the quiet confidence that the future would always be bigger, faster, higher. But behind the champagne flutes and iconic stewardess uniforms was a harder story. A life built on ruthless bets on unproven technology. Cozy deals with Washington that blurred the line between national policy and corporate ambition. A balance sheet wired like a financial time bomb, ticking behind the polished lounges and the smiling crews. It's an example of what happens when national prestige, corporate pride, and easy money all strap into the same cockpit. Pan Am's story is one of breathtaking vision and slow-motion self-destruction, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Juan Tripo's drive to build a world airline, the secret 707 deal that launched the jet age, the all-in gamble on the 747, the Lockerbie bombing that shattered public trust, deregulation that turned privilege into exposure, and finally those last crews flying through the night, knowing that by morning their airline would be gone. So let me take you back to the beginning to see how an empire of the air was built so high that its fall could darken airports around the world in a single night. There was a time when one airline didn't just sell tickets, it sold an idea of America. A blue globe on a white tail, circling the world like a flag in the sky, promising progress, glamour, and a seat in the future for anyone who could afford the fare. On paper, Pan American World Airways was a private company. In reality, it functioned as the United States' unofficial global flag carrier, a flying extension of Washington's will. From the late 1920s through the Cold War, its roots were drawn with more than money in mind. Airfields appeared in places where the State Department wanted influence, not just passengers. Crews flew diplomats, soldiers, and occasionally people whose names never appeared on any manifest. Because of that role, Pan Am's story is one of breathtaking innovation and global connection, at times inspiring and at times chilling. This was the airline that turned flying boats into floating palaces, that made crossing an ocean in a few hours feel normal, that helped launch the jet age with a secret bulk deal for Boeing's 707, and then doubled down with an all-in gamble on the 747. It stitched together continents with radio beacons, weather stations, and island bases. It also stitched together something else, a quiet partnership between corporate ambition and state power. Presidents listened when Pan Am's leaders talked. Dictators made room on their beaches for Pan Am runways. The company trained foreign crews, advised governments, and in some cases provided cover for intelligence operations. Not only did it carry tourists and executives, it carried messages, leverage, and the subtle pressure of a superpower that now had wings. That reach made Pan Am feel inevitable, too big to fail, too important to question, too woven into the fabric of American life to imagine gone. But it also created a problem that would haunt every decision. What happens when a private company becomes so entangled with national power that it forgets how to survive as a business? When prestige flights matter more than profit, when political routes matter more than sustainable ones, when the empire in the sky looks secure right up until the bill arrives. It's an example of what happens when scale and symbolism outrun balance sheets and boring discipline. The same forces that elevated Pan Am, government favors, geopolitical priorities, the hunger to be first and biggest, would later trap it in a maze of high costs, rigid expectations, and brutal exposure to every shock the world could throw at it. To see that clearly, the story has to be rewound. Away from the dark December night of 1991, back past the 747s lined up at JFK, past the champagne in first class, and the Cold War routes arcing over polar ice. Let me take you back to a muddy field on the edge of the Florida Keys in 1927, where a handful of men, a flimsy airplane, and a mail contract on the Cuban border set out to build an airline, and accidentally built an empire. From that scrappy border run would come the flying clippers, the first jets, the jumbo gamble, the slow-motion collapse, and finally one last flight home through the darkness. There was a time when international flight meant mud, mosquitoes, and a government clerk with a stopwatch. No glamorous clippers, no blue globe logo, just a race against rival empires and the clock. Let me take you back to Key West, 1927. The air is thick, the runway is barely a cleared strip of coral and weeds, and the United States is suddenly terrified of being late. Europe's powers are probing the Caribbean, German and British companies are eyeing routes to Havana, and Washington decides it needs an American airline to carry mail to Latin America before someone else plants their flag in the sky. On paper, this should have been simple. The post office puts out a bid for an airmail route from Key West to Havana. Several outfits rush in, some with planes, some with money, some with political friends. What happens next looks less like a clean competition and more like a backroom card game. Deadlines shift, applications are reconsidered, and at the last moment, a tiny, almost imaginary carrier called Pan American Airways ends up holding the winning hand. At first, Pan Am doesn't even have the right airplane ready, so the inaugural international U.S. airmail flight to Havana is actually flown under a hurried partnership, using a borrowed Fokker seaplane that creaks more than it roars. The pilots take off from the water because the land strip is too rough, lifting into storm-laden air over 90 miles of open sea with nothing but dead reckoning, a compass, and the promise of a lighthouse beam somewhere ahead. These first flights are closer to maritime expeditions than modern aviation. Engines cough, fuel gauges lie, weather reports are guesses. Pilots skim waves to stay under the clouds, hunting for the thin white flash of surf on the Cuban coast. Miss that, and there is no radar, no GPS, just the slow, cold arithmetic of distance, fuel, and how long a man can tread water. Behind the scenes, early Pan Am leaders are watching something more important than the horizon. They realize that a mail contract is not just mail. It is guaranteed money, government protection, and, crucially, the right to exclude competitors from the same route. Juan Trippe, young, ambitious, and already thinking in maps rather than single flights, sees that if he can string these contracts together across the Caribbean, he will not just run an airline, he will control an air empire. His story is one of using public missions to build private power, carry the flag, carry the mail, talk about national prestige, and in return receive exclusive routes, subsidies, and quiet help leaning on unfriendly local governments. It's an example of what happens when political access becomes a business model. By the time the Key West Havana run feels routine, Trippe is already looking past the jungle strips to farther shores. The question is no longer whether Pan Am will survive. It's how far this new, protected network can reach, and what lines will be crossed to push it beyond the Caribbean. By the time the jungle outposts are humming, another force has quietly taken control of Pan Am's cockpit. Not a pilot, not an engineer, a tall, reserved man with a Yale ring on his finger and a world map in his head. Juan Trippe is not the scrappy garage founder from a tale of poverty to sudden wealth. He is old American money, born into a comfortable New Jersey family, sent to the right prep schools, polished at Yale. There was a time when that pedigree was a passport as powerful as any visa, and Trippe uses it with clinical precision. He flies in World War I as a naval aviator, never sees combat glory, but comes home with something more dangerous, an obsession. Airplanes, to him, are no longer fragile toys. They are tools to crush distance, to bend time, to shrink the planet into something a single empire might manage. His story is one of early disappointments hardening into doctrine. After the war, he throws himself into aviation ventures that wobble and fail, from small charter operations to shoestring regional lines that can't make the numbers work. The planes are unreliable. The passengers are few. The money disappears. Watching partners go under and investors lose patience, Trippe draws a brutal conclusion. In this industry, romance dies first. Only scale survives. Only government mail contracts, diplomatic support, and near monopoly power can keep an airline alive. That belief fuses with a personality that many find magnetic, and many more find chilling. Trippe is famously cold in meetings, speaking in flat, measured tones, staring through people as much as at them. He works late, remembers every figure, forgets almost every birthday. Friends describe him as driven, secretive, allergic to small talk. Yet he can turn on charm when it matters, gliding through Manhattan clubs and Washington drawing rooms, trading easy conversation about family and football while quietly steering it back to landing rights in Brazil. To Trippe, airplanes are not machines. They are instruments of geopolitics. A new route is a new line of influence. A base in Manila or Hong Kong is as much a listening post as a refueling stop. At times inspiring and at times chilling, his vision treats the sky like a chessboard where nations, corporations, and passengers are all pieces to be moved, and he has the network to move them. At Yale, he joins a tight circle of aviation-obsessed classmates and older alumni, what journalists will later call the Yale Aviation Mafia. Bankers, lawyers, future diplomats, intelligence men. It's an example of what happens when elite friendships age into a ruling class. When Pan Am needs capital, a discreet phone call brings Wall Street into the room. When it wants foreign concessions, a former classmate now in the State Department nudges a negotiation. When a Latin American government hesitates, a quiet visit from a well-connected envoy helps them reconsider. By the late 1920s, Tripp is no longer thinking in routes, but in systems. A world system. Transoceanic flying boats linking continents, hubs radiating influence from New York to Shanghai. Pan Am's blue globe not just painted on tails, but wrapped around the map itself. Let me take you back to that moment. A man in a dark office, cigarette smoke curling over a wall-sized chart, drawing lines across oceans that no airline has dared to cross yet. He doesn't just want an airline. He wants the spine of global air travel, and he's about to start carving it into the world, one risky new line at a time. Those lines on the wall weren't just routes. They were claims, territory. And Juan Trippe knew that if Pan Am wanted an empire in the sky, it had to start where the map looked weak and the politics looked flexible. There was a time when Europe still dominated the oceans and dreamed of dominating the air. British, French, and German carriers were probing into Latin America, trying to stitch their old colonial influence onto this new technology. Trippe moved first. He went to Washington and sold a very simple, very flattering story. America needed a chosen instrument in the air, a single champion to keep foreign airlines out of the Western Hemisphere. Pan Am, of course, was ready to sacrifice itself for the nation. Because of that pitch, and because Trippe was relentless in DC hallways, Pan Am won more than mail contracts. It won policy, treaties, diplomatic notes, quiet understandings that said, if anyone is going to fly south from the United States, it will be Pan Am. Not only did this give him leverage abroad, it let him walk into presidential offices across Latin America with something no local carrier could offer: the blessing of the United States government. Let me take you back to those meetings. A strong man in a white suit. A desk stacked with decrees. Outside, a capital city where electricity flickers and half the population lives in poverty. Trippe would arrive with engineers, glossy brochures, and a promise: concrete runways, radio beacons, maintenance hangars, training for national crews, and the prestige of being on Pan Am's global timetable. In return, he wanted a signature, exclusive landing rights, no European competitors, often no local competitors, sometimes for decades. It was diplomacy, business, and quiet coercion rolled into one. Pan Am would build the airport, paint the control tower, even help the regime's family fly in and out in style. The dictator would, in turn, sign away his skies. For countries crushed by debt and with few alternatives, it felt like progress. Suddenly, a businessman in Lima could reach New York in days instead of weeks. A family in Guatemala could imagine life beyond the isthmus. Mail, medicine, and money moved faster. Jobs appeared on the tarmac. Yet the new connectivity came with invisible handcuffs. Fares were high, routes were chosen in New York, and local airlines were often reduced to feeders for an American network they didn't control. His story is one of at times inspiring and at times chilling modernization. Pan Am's blue globe meant escape from isolation, but it also meant that an entire region's air travel depended on the health, priorities, and politics of a single U.S. company. It's an example of what happens when national power and corporate ambition fuse so tightly that no one can tell where one ends and the other begins. That fusion made Pan Am untouchable for decades, but the same political closeness that protected it in the age of strongmen and closed markets would, finally, become a trap. When the rules of the game changed, and the word deregulation hit aviation like a bomb. That fusion of national power and corporate ambition did something else too. It gave Juan Trippe permission to dream on a scale that made even presidents nervous. If Pan Am would be the empire's wings, then the oceans themselves had to be tamed. There was a time when crossing the Atlantic meant days on a liner or risking a fragile land plane on short, unreliable runways. Tripp's answer was brutal in its simplicity and audacity. If the world didn't have runways, Pan Am would use the oceans as runways. Enter the Boeing 314 Clipper, a flying boat so massive and self-contained it turned sheltered harbors into gateways for the global elite. The 314 was not just an airplane. It was a floating palace with wings, a machine that could lift more than 70 people and enough fuel to leap from continent to continent, yet gently settle onto water like a ship. Let me take you back to the late 1930s. As most Americans still traveled by train, a tiny fraction of the ultra-wealthy were stepping from mahogany launch boats onto Pan Am docks in New York, Honolulu, Lisbon, Manila. Inside, air travel was closer to a luxury cruise than a cramped cabin. White-jacketed stewards moved through wide aisles with silver service dining, carving roasts, pouring champagne, serving caviar at linen-covered tables. By night, the cabin transformed. Seats folded into sleeping berths, curtains drew shut, passengers changed into pajamas and lay down in real beds while the engines droned over black water. There were lounges, writing desks, even dressing rooms. In an age of lingering poverty and breadlines, this was flying as theater, flying as a declaration of wealth and power. But beneath the glamour was a ruthless calculation. The Clippers were unproven long-range giants, staggeringly expensive, and they needed a whole hidden world to support them. Pan Am built island bases and refueling stations like stepping stones across the Pacific and Atlantic, carving runways out of jungles, blasting coral reefs, negotiating with colonial governors and military officers. It was cold. Hard money poured into lagoons and rock, all to make sure no rival could follow the same path. When Pan Am launched the first scheduled transatlantic passenger service in 1939, the headlines were breathless. Not only could a passenger leave New York and arrive in Europe the next day, the route itself redrew the mental map of the planet. Oceans that had once been moats now felt like narrow channels. The world, suddenly, was smaller. His story is one of turning geography into infrastructure, of taking what looked like empty blue space on a map and converting it into a private highway system. It's an example of what happens when one company is allowed to treat the planet as a design problem. Yet as the flying boats conquered the seas and Pan Am floated serenely above the old order, another kind of storm was gathering. In Europe and across the Pacific, men were planning a war that would hunger for long-range aircraft, remote island bases, global communications. Everything Tripp had built for luxury travel was about to be weaponized, and Pan Am's glamorous Clippers were about to find themselves on the front lines. There was a time when Pan Am's white Clippers felt like floating hotels, not weapons. Silk tablecloths, silver service, movie stars in evening dress. Then the world caught fire, and overnight those same graceful hulls were treated by generals as assets, not amenities. On the eve of World War II, no one else had what Pan Am had. Bases scattered from Alaska to Brazil, mechanics who could coax life out of engines in jungle heat, radio operators who knew every crackle of the ether between Miami and Manila. To the US military, it was obvious. Why build a global air empire from scratch when one already existed? The line between airline and auxiliary air force began to blur, quietly at first, then completely. Contracts arrived that didn't say luxury anywhere. Pan Am ferried bombers and transports across oceans, taking aircraft from American factories to Britain, to Africa, to the Middle East. Its pilots, once famous for serving champagne, now flew in blackout conditions, hugging radio beacons through storms, delivering machines built for killing. The company trained thousands of military pilots and navigators, turning civilian know-how into wartime doctrine. In classrooms in Coral Gables and hangars on remote islands, the lessons were precise, relentless, and very well paid. Let me take you back to the map for a moment. Before the war, Pan Am's routes traced elegant arcs across the Atlantic and Pacific. During the war, those arcs exploded into a web. Across West Africa, Pan Am teams hacked airstrips out of scrubland for the South Atlantic ferry route. In India and China, they helped carve bases into valleys and plateaus to feed the hump airlift over the Himalayas. In the Pacific, they extended chains of fields and seaplane anchorages from Hawaii toward Australia and beyond. What started as emergency logistics for survival would, in peacetime, look remarkably like a ready-made commercial network. Because of its ruthless efficiency and willingness to go wherever Washington pointed, Pan Am gained more than money. It gained protection. When equipment was scarce, it received priority. When foreign governments hesitated over landing rights, American diplomats leaned in, reminding them who had built their wartime airfields. Pan Am's war story is one of patriotic service and at times inspiring and at times chilling self-interest, as the company learned that national security was the ultimate bargaining chip. There was a quieter shift, too. Inside Pan Am's leadership, a belief hardened. The airline wasn't just a business, it was an instrument of American power. That mindset would be intoxicating. It created habits, calling the State Department when negotiations stalled, assuming Washington would tilt the field, that were useful in war and dangerous in peace. When the guns finally fell silent, Pan Am emerged with unmatched reach, deep government ties, and a dangerous conviction that the rules would always bend for the blue globe. It's an example of what happens when a company goes to war and comes back thinking it will never have to fight alone again. But when the war ended, the world Pan Am had mastered vanished almost overnight. Those remote island lagoons and sheltered harbors that once made flying boats essential were suddenly surrounded by something far more useful: concrete. Wartime airfields, lengthened for bombers and bristling with new technology, dotted the globe. There was a time when a clipper easing down onto a moonlit bay looked like the future. Now it looked slow, expensive, and trapped in the past. Runways changed everything. Land-based airliners could carry more people, turn around faster, and land almost anywhere a military engineer had poured asphalt. If Pan Am clung to the water, it would drown. So Juan Trippe pivoted with the same cold speed he once used to carve mail routes out of jungle and reef, dumping glamorous flying boats and rushing to buy Douglas DC-4s and Lockheed Constellations, trading polished hulls and spray for aluminum tubes and concrete. Those new aircraft met a new kind of passenger. Millions of soldiers came home from Europe and the Pacific with a taste for the wider world, with memories of Paris streets and Pacific beaches that would not fade. Businessmen followed, chasing global markets, chasing money in London banks, Caracas oil fields, and Tokyo boardrooms. His story is one of timing as much as ambition. Just as the world wanted to move, Pan Am already had the map, the bases, and the planes. Because of U.S. policy, that map was heavily tilted. Washington, wary of chaotic competition in foreign skies, effectively anointed Pan Am as America's global flag carrier. Domestic rivals like TWA, American, and United could battle over Chicago to Los Angeles, New York to St. Louis, family vacations and business shuttles. But when it came to Rio, Nairobi, Hong Kong, and Rome, the blue globe usually went up first. The result was an empire of routes, built not only with planes and money, but with treaties, hearings, and quiet phone calls in government offices. Pan Am understood that power had to look good. The airline wrapped itself in a brand that sold more than tickets. It sold an identity. The Blue Globe logo suggested the entire planet was within reach. Cabins were polished, uniforms crisp, service drilled into a kind of airborne theater. Advertisements promised not just transportation, but a modern, cosmopolitan American life. Martinis over the Atlantic, businessmen closing deals at 30,000 feet, elegant families stepping off jetways into the sun. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the effect was simple. If anyone thought about flying across an ocean, they thought about Pan Am. It seemed untouchable through the late 1940s and 1950s, a flag, a brand, and a near monopoly fused into one. Yet just beyond those gleaming constellations, another revolution was forming. A new technology was about to appear on the horizon, one that would demand even bigger bets than flying boats ever did, and punish any mistake at jet speed. There was a time when the word jet sounded less like transportation and more like science fiction. Early attempts had not gone well. In the early 1950s, Britain's de Havilland Comet promised a new age, then tore itself apart in mid-air, twice, killing dozens and shattering confidence in jetliners. Engineers learned hard lessons about metal fatigue and pressurized cabins, and airline executives quietly thanked fate that they had not bet their entire future on this shiny new miracle. Yet on the other side of the continent, in Seattle, Boeing was doing something far more dangerous. It was spending its own money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to build a jet airliner no one had asked for. The Boeing 707 grew out of a prototype called the Dash 80, a demonstrator that famously did a barrel roll over a crowd of airline bosses. Impressive, yes. But writing a check for a fleet of them? That was another matter. The jets were unproven, terrifyingly expensive, and would require airports, maintenance, and pilots to be reinvented almost from scratch. Let me take you back to the moment Juan Trippe decided hesitation was more dangerous than the leap. While rival CEOs ran the numbers and waited for someone else to move first, Trippe quietly met with Boeing and Douglas in secret. In 1955, he stunned the industry by placing a massive, confidential order, dozens of Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s, a twin bet on speed that no airline had the nerve or the appetite for risk to match. Overnight, the message was clear. Jets were not a question anymore. They were the future, and Pan Am intended to own that future. His story is one of using money as a weapon and confidence as collateral. Because Trippe was willing to commit, Boeing's terrifying gamble suddenly looked bankable. Banks loosened, production lines spun up, and the 707 program went from speculative vanity project to the backbone of a new global empire in the sky. Pan Am was effectively the launch customer that made the jet age commercially real, de-risking Boeing's program by promising that those gleaming machines would not sit idle on the ramp. The impact was immediate and brutal. New York to Paris shrank from an overnight ordeal with fuel stops to a single hop in hours. Tokyo, London, Rome, Buenos Aires, cities that once felt like expeditions became weekend possibilities for the wealthy. Jets climbed higher, flew faster, and smoothed out the violent weather that had made long-haul flying an endurance test. Cabins grew quieter, routes went non-stop, and demand exploded as global travel turned from exotic fantasy into an aspirational life goal. At times inspiring and at times chilling, It's an example of what happens when one man's appetite for speed can bend an entire industry's timeline. Trippa had just proven that a single airline could pull the future forward by a decade. But the same hunger for scale, the same faith that bigger and faster would always pay, was already setting Pan Am on a path where one wrong night, one shock to the system, could send that empire over a financial cliff. So if Tripp could bend the future, where do you put the altar to that power? For Pan Am, the answer rose out of the tarmac at New York's Idlewild Airport, later JFK. A concrete prophecy called the Worldport. There was a time when an airport terminal was just a box with doors. Worldport was a spectacle. Opened in 1960, its most famous feature was that impossible saucer-like roof, a 4-acre concrete overhang that seemed to float over the gates with no visible support. Jets could nose right under the lip of the roof, letting passengers walk straight from lounge to aircraft under a single sweeping canopy of glass and steel. You didn't just go to the airport to leave. You went to see the future parked outside. From the highway, the message was blunt. Giant blue globe logo. Endless curtain walls of glass. A rooftop that looked less like transportation and more like a spaceship landing pad. Inside, Pan Am wrapped that architecture in money and theater. Plush clipper lounges, uniformed hostesses gliding past departure boards listing London, Tokyo, Beirut, Lagos. Worldport turned a check-in hall into a stage where the empire of air travel could show off its wealth. Worldport was a physical manifestation of a promise: seamless global connection. Let me take you back to those early jet age years. A passenger could land from a 707 coming in from Paris, step into a bright, circular concourse, and within minutes be rerouted onto a 707 bound for Rio or a 707 crossing the Pacific. The building's radial design, the drive-up gates, the panoramic view of the ramp all reinforce the same feeling. This isn't a terminal, it's a portal. Underneath the glamour was cold operational logic. Pan Am wanted a single, centralized hub where transatlantic and trans-Pacific banks of flights could meet, cross, and depart like clockwork. Concentrate the arrivals, stack the departures, keep the aircraft moving, and the metal earns all day. Worldport's layout let the airline choreograph those connections, turning New York into the beating heart of a worldwide network that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, looked more like an air traffic command center than a civilian airport. But temples are expensive. The roof alone demanded complex engineering, heavy maintenance, and constant upgrades. Pan Am poured money into exclusive lounges, custom baggage systems, dedicated maintenance bays, and back-office infrastructure, all built on the assumption that international demand would grow forever and that high, regulated fares would protect the margins. It's an example of what happens when architecture takes the old business model as gospel. Here's the pattern interrupt. Concrete doesn't deregulate. Worldport was a cathedral for a specific religion of air travel. Few competitors, government-managed routes, predictable fuel, thick yields. When that religion changed in the 1970s, the very grandeur that once projected power started acting like a financial millstone, dragging down an airline that could no longer afford its own monument. And Pan Am wasn't done building altars, because the next leap, the one with a hump on its back and hundreds of seats to fill, would lock the company into an even bigger bet. That hump on the back wasn't just an engineering quirk. It was a billboard at 35,000 feet, announcing that there was a time when flying Pan Am meant stepping into a different layer of reality, where the world's problems stayed politely on the ground. Let me take you back to a 1960s Pan Am cabin. The aisle is wide, the seats are wide, and so are the expectations. Elbow room is not a perk. it's the baseline. Real linen on the tray tables, cocktails in heavy glass that clinks when the turbulence hits, and an actual cart with a carved roast beef, sliced to order like a rolling hotel banquet. Passengers light cigarettes under no-smoking signs that haven't been invented yet, while the cabin crew moves through the haze with the calm precision of a stage performance. Because this is a performance. Pan Am trains its crews not just to pour drinks, but to project an entire idea of American life, confident, unhurried, cosmopolitan. The stewardesses, especially, are cast as leading characters. Strict height and weight requirements, regular weigh-ins, and grooming standards that read more like a casting call than a job description. Tailored uniforms with pillbox hats and gloves, hemlines that adjust with the decade but always stop short of chaos. Their story is one of freedom and discipline at the same time. On paper, the job is work. In the ads, it's an audition for the jet set. Pan Am quietly turns its own employees into marketing. The promise is clear. Join this flying family and see the world. Collect layovers in Rome, Tokyo, Rio. Come home with souvenirs and stories instead of mortgages and PTA meetings. At times inspiring, and at times chilling. It's an example of what happens when a company sells a lifestyle so hard that the line between person and product almost disappears. The passengers are buying a fantasy too. Pan Am's advertising doesn't just show beaches and landmarks. It shows a kind of American modernity with smooth edges and no visible effort. The blue globe logo becomes shorthand for wealth and reach and power, for an empire drawn in jet routes instead of borders. Not only is this the airline that helped launch the jet age, it's the airline you choose when the trip really matters. Honeymoons, business deals, diplomatic missions, the first time a middle-class family ever leaves their own continent. Wealthy travelers treat Pan Am like an airborne club. Aspirational middle-class travelers treat it like a ticket into a future they've only seen on television. The roast beef, the champagne, the smiling crew, all of it says the same thing. The future is orderly, profitable, and permanently up. However, beneath the polished service, Pan Am is loading something else into the hold. Debt from new jets, obligations to governments and manufacturers, and a quiet belief that the river of passengers will only ever rise. The glamour makes the planes feel lighter. On the balance sheet, the weight tells a different story, and not everything that Pan Am is carrying will be able to stay in the air. That weight isn't just financial, it's strategic. Because inside Juan Tripe's head, every seat, every flight, every distant speck on the globe is part of a campaign map. This isn't an airline. It's a long, rolling war for territory in the sky. There was a time when oceans were walls. Trippe looks at them and sees borders to be redrawn. Routes are not lines on a timetable, they are colonies. Whoever flies New York to London first doesn't just sell tickets, they plant a flag. Havana, Manila, Hong Kong, Nairobi, Rio. Each new dot on the map is a captured city, taken not with tanks, but with treaties, money, and speed. So let me take you back to the way Pan Am actually advances. First, the planners spread out maps in New York, tracing traffic flows, colonial trade routes, military bases, and shipping lanes. They calculate which cities will grow, which governments are weak, which ports can handle a flying boat or a 707. Then the diplomats go to work, lobbying State Department officials, courting presidents and dictators, whispering that if America wants influence in some fragile capital, it needs that blue globe logo on the tarmac. By the late 1930s, Pan Am has exclusive rights across much of Latin America. The Clippers stitch together Miami, San Juan, Rio, Buenos Aires in a chain of protected outposts. After the war, the same playbook marches across the Atlantic and Pacific. Before a rival can even assemble a bid, Pan Am is already signing bilateral air agreements, building radio stations on remote islands, pre-positioning crews and spare parts, and then flooding the route with capacity so no one else can profitably enter. In a world where governments ration access and treat air routes like diplomatic favors, this warlike mindset works. The rules reward conquest. Regulators limit how many airlines can fly internationally. Early movers are granted near monopolies. Pan Am, as America's de facto flag carrier, wins deal after deal by promising prestige, security, and reach. The result is an empire of air, held not by guns, but by paper and jet fuel. But every empire is shaped by the weapon it favors. Pan Am optimizes everything for expansion: long-haul glamour, giant aircraft, political leverage, impressive losses. Tolerated today in the name of tomorrow's dominance. What it does not build is a culture of lean operations, nimble pricing, or obsessive customer-focused profitability. Efficiency is secondary to reach. Flexibility is sacrificed for scale. For a while, the world cooperates. Borders stay closed to competitors, treaties stay frozen, and Pan Am's enemies are foreign carriers and the occasional upstart, not a true free-for-all. Yet quietly, the pressure is building. New jets make distance cheaper. Other nations demand reciprocity. Economists in Washington start asking why passengers should pay for one airline's grandeur. When deregulation finally arrives, it doesn't just open the market, it flips the battlefield overnight. The skills that built Pan Am's empire, lobbying, conquest, sheer size, will soon turn from assets into liabilities, and the war Trip trained for will no longer be the one being fought. Deregulation flips the rules, but Pan Am is still thinking in empires, not skirmishes. And nothing captures that more than the moment it decides to bet the whole airline on a machine so big, so ambitious, that many engineers quietly wondered whether it would ever get off the ground. Let me take you back to the late 1960s. There was a time when international demand is exploding, terminals are jammed, and runways look like parking lots. Jets like the 707 have shrunk the planet, but they've also created a traffic jam at 30,000 feet. Boeing arrives with a proposal that sounds insane. A double-deck giant, twin aisles, hundreds of seats, a flying ocean liner that will move more people in one takeoff than some airlines carry in a day. Most carriers hesitate. Pan Am does not. Because at the center of this story stands Juan Trippe, and across the table from him is Boeing's Bill Allen. The two men share a particular faith, that the future belongs to whoever can move the most people, the farthest, the cheapest. Trippe wants a bigger throne for his empire in the sky, and Allen needs a launch customer willing to risk everything. They shake hands, and with that handshake, the 747 program is effectively greenlit. Pan Am orders more than 24 of these giants before a single passenger has seen one, committing hundreds of millions of dollars in money it does not really have to spare. New hangars must be built because the old ones are too small. Maintenance crews must be retrained to handle engines the size of small houses. Simulators, spare parts, new ground equipment, specialized tugs, longer jet bridges, even redesigned catering systems. Every detail of Pan Am's life is rewritten around this one airframe. The financial bet is brutal and simple. Each flight now carries hundreds of seats. To make the math work, those seats cannot be symbols of prestige. They must be filled. That means aggressive marketing, discounted fares, and a quiet admission that the age of air travel as a private club for the ultra-wealthy is coming to an end. On board, though, the experience feels like science fiction. Twin aisles, higher ceilings, quieter cabins, and that famous spiral staircase leading to the upper deck. Early Pan Am 747s used the upstairs as a lounge, piano bars, cocktails, a living room in the sky. It is at times inspiring and at times chilling. The same machine that democratizes long-haul travel for the middle class also teaches millions to see 5,000 miles as an overnight commute. For a while, the gamble works. The blue globe on a 747 tail becomes a moving monument to American power. But it's an example of what happens when confidence blurs into overreach. Those huge cabins that once signaled dominance will soon mean overcapacity, crushing debt, and a terrifying vulnerability when the world suddenly slows down. And then the world hits the brakes. There was a time when every forecast chart in Pan Am's boardroom pointed one way: up. More passengers, more routes, more money to feed the new jumbo empire. But as the early 1970s unfold, the smooth climb turns into turbulence. A global downturn cools business travel. Currencies wobble. Governments quietly start tightening belts. Just as those gleaming 747s arrive in bulk, the line of people willing to pay for a seat begins to shrink. Then 1973 detonates. The Arab-Israeli War, the OPEC embargo, oil prices quadrupling in months. Jet fuel, once a manageable cost, becomes a predator stalking every flight. For an airline built on long-haul jets, it is a nightmare. Those big Rolls-Royce and Pratt & Whitney engines drink fuel by the ton, not the gallon. Every takeoff becomes a high-stakes bet that enough paying passengers will show up to justify lighting them. Here is the brutal math. A 747 has enormous fixed costs: lease payments, interest on the debt that bought it, maintenance, crews, gate fees, insurance. Whether it flies full or half empty, those bills arrive right on time. When the cabin is packed, the weight of those expenses spreads across hundreds of fares. When it goes out with entire rows unused, the same costs sit on fewer shoulders, and margins vanish. An empty upper deck is not just quiet. It is a financial warning siren. Pan Am's managers can see it on the load sheets. London is soft. Rio is soft. Even New York-Paris, the golden artery, starts to wobble. So they scramble, cutting frequencies on marginal routes, consolidating flights that used to leave twice a day into one, parking jets in the desert sun with engines capped and windows taped. They run promotions, tinker with fares, and try to stimulate demand without puncturing the brand's aura of exclusivity and reliability. Champagne and crystal, but maybe fewer bottles. A glamorous smile, but behind it, a calculator. Let me take you back to the competitive map for a second, because this is where the trap closes. Domestic carriers like United and American can react by feeding their international flights with passengers from dozens of US cities. They shift capacity, reroute planes, use their home networks as shock absorbers. Pan Am has no such cushion, no true domestic web, no river of short-haul traffic flowing into its long-haul hubs. When demand drops in Frankfurt or Tokyo, there is no easy way to backfill those empty seats with people from Cleveland or Dallas. His story is one of vision meeting gravity, and Pan Am's life in the 1970s is at times inspiring and at times chilling. The airline survives this era. It renegotiates loans, trims fat, leans on its prestige, but the damage is done. The balance sheet is weaker, the fleet is mismatched to the new reality, and the empire is more exposed than anyone wants to admit. All of this is happening just as another storm forms on the horizon. The end of the cozy, regulated world that once protected Pan Am like a favored child. There was a time when the rules of the airline game were written in marble and guarded by Washington. Routes were assigned, fares were approved, competition was choreographed. Pan Am had grown up inside that world, had helped design it, had learned how to turn regulation into a moat around its empire. Then, in 1978, the referee walked off the field. The Airline Deregulation Act did something almost unthinkable for that era. It stripped the federal government of its power to decide which airline could fly where and for how much. No more guaranteed fares, no more protected routes, no more slow, polite hearings at the Civil Aeronautics Board. Airlines could enter new markets, slash prices overnight, launch promotions, abandon losers, double down on winners. It unleashed a wave of competition, mergers, price wars, and suddenly flying became less a public utility and more a brutal retail business. For carriers like American and United, with dense domestic networks and millions of business travelers, this was dangerous but also exciting. They could connect city to city, build hubs, experiment with fares, and feed their own international flights with a river of passengers. For Pan Am, it was a different story. Pan Am had been optimized for a very specific world. International routes carved up by bilateral agreements, negotiated like treaties between governments. The company's life was built around embassies, ministries, and presidents, not bargain hunters with coupon books. Its power came from exclusive rights to fly across oceans, from New York to London, New York to Paris, New York to Tokyo. At home, though, it was strangely weak. No real domestic network. No spiderweb of short hops feeding its glamorous long-haul jets. When deregulation hit, that elegant design turned into a trap. New low-cost carriers could undercut Pan Am on price. Domestic giants could funnel passengers from Omaha or Dallas or Cleveland into their own international flights. Pan Am's 747s sat there like palaces in the sky, but too often the throne rooms were half empty. Inside the company, the cultural shock was enormous. Executives who had spent careers negotiating with heads of state were now asked to win Tuesday morning fare wars against upstarts with no memory of the old world. Revenue management, yield curves, discount buckets. This was the new language of power, and it felt, at times, beneath an airline that had once treated air travel like a black tie event. The story of Pan Am in this moment is one of prestige colliding with a suddenly ruthless marketplace, at times inspiring and, at times, chilling. Because of deregulation, every strength Pan Am had carefully built, its focus on long-haul glamour, its massive wide-body fleet, its diplomatic connections, began to look like a liability. It needed domestic feed, fast. It needed flexibility, smaller planes, more routes, more money. So Pan Am reached for a solution that seemed perfectly logical and fatally flawed. Let me take you back to the decision that executives believed would finally save the airline. A single, massive acquisition that promised instant domestic power, and instead slipped a slow-acting poison into the company's veins. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. In reality, it was the moment Pan Am stopped being the hunter and quietly became the prey. There was a time when Pan Am's greatest weakness was hiding in plain sight on every departure board in America. The Blue Globe logo was everywhere overseas, yet inside the United States, passengers had to fly someone else just to reach a Pan Am gate. National Airlines seemed to solve that overnight. A medium-sized domestic carrier with dense routes up and down the U.S. East Coast and into the booming Sun Belt. Exactly the life-giving feeder traffic Pan Am craved for its global empire. So in 1980, Pan Am lunged. A bidding war broke out, driven less by calm strategy and more by pride, fear, and the belief that whoever controlled national would control the future. Pan Am won, paying around $437 million, most of it borrowed. That price did not just buy airplanes and routes. It bought interest payments, expectations, and a margin for error that was now measured in millimeters. In a world of volatile fuel prices and looming deregulation, that was a ruthless gamble. The theory was elegant. Plug National's domestic network into Pan Am's international hubs, capture the whole journey, capture all the money. The reality was an integration nightmare that began the moment the ink dried. National flew different aircraft types with their own maintenance systems, spare parts, and training pipelines. Pan Am's life had been built around long-haul wide-bodies. Suddenly, it was juggling smaller domestic jets that didn't fit its rhythms or its culture. Labor made it worse. 2 sets of pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, each with their own unions, seniority lists, and grudges. Merging them was less like building a family and more like forcing rival clans into the same house and locking the door. Who got the best routes? Who kept their pay scales? Every answer created a new enemy. Management time that should have gone into navigating a changing industry was burned in endless arbitration and internal warfare. Meanwhile, the vaunted synergies moved in slow motion. Routes that looked perfect on a map did not mesh cleanly in real life. Schedules missed connections by just enough to annoy passengers. Some national routes fed Pan Am's international flights. Many simply bled cash on their own. The promised river of domestic traffic turned out to be a trickle, but the interest meter on that $437 million kept running, day after day. Because of this deal, Pan Am entered the 1980s carrying not just debt, but distraction. It's an example of what happens when a company already under pressure reaches for scale instead of stability, for size instead of resilience. National was supposed to be a lifeline. Instead, it became an anchor, quietly tightening around Pan Am's ankles just as terrorism, new oil shocks, and brutal competition from deregulated rivals began to pull the entire industry into deeper water. And the real storm had not even hit yet. National was supposed to make Pan Am stronger. Instead, it made one brutal truth impossible to ignore. The empire needed money, now. And when an airline that once printed prestige on every boarding pass starts pawning off its best assets, you know the story has entered a different phase of life. To see how desperate it became, let me take you back to the most valuable patch of concrete in Pan Am's world, London Heathrow. This wasn't just an airport, it was a bottleneck of power. Heathrow had limited runways, limited slots, and almost unlimited premium traffic. Business travelers, bankers, oil executives, diplomats, the kind of people who treated first class like a commuting expense. There was a time when controlling takeoff and landing rights there was like owning a toll booth on the bridge between American wealth and European power. From the 1950s through the jet age, Pan Am didn't just fly to Heathrow, it dominated the U.S. Heathrow corridor. For generations of Americans, the flight number from New York to London might as well have been a national ritual. The blue globe logo at Heathrow's gates signaled something larger than one company. It said, "This is America's gateway to Europe. This is the flag carrier. This is how the empire travels." Other U.S. airlines looked on with a mix of envy and rage, locked out by bilateral agreements, while Pan Am collected the glamour and the money. But deregulation, fuel shocks, debt, and the slow bleed from National turned that privileged position into something else, collateral. By 1990, Pan Am was losing cash at a speed that made even its enormous history feel small. Creditors were circling, planes were being repossessed, and management needed a lifeline that didn't exist. So they did the unthinkable. They sold Heathrow. In a deal announced that year, Pan Am agreed to sell its prized Heathrow routes and slots to United Airlines for around $400 million. Not aircraft, not spare parts, not a training center in Miami. Time on a runway. Rights to land and depart in London. The transaction was rational on paper, a classic cause and effect move. Sell the crown jewel to stay alive a little longer. But the moral color was hard to miss. United, once a domestic rival confined largely to US routes, was now buying its way into the club that Pan Am had dominated for decades. This was more than an asset sale. It was a transfer of identity. Pan Am was auctioning off the very symbol of its international prestige to an airline that had spent years watching it from the sidelines. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when a company mortgages yesterday's glory to pay tomorrow's fuel bill. The money bought time. But if Pan Am had to sell Heathrow just to keep breathing, what would happen when the next crisis hit? One that money alone couldn't fix. What happened was worse than a crisis. It was a spectacle of horror played out at 31,000 feet, in front of the entire world. And for Pan Am, already bleeding money, it was the one headline no airline can ever afford to own. Let me take you back to the night of December 21st, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 lifted off from London Heathrow, bound for New York, a routine transatlantic hop on a cold winter evening. 38 minutes later, the Boeing 747 exploded over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. The jet broke apart in the sky, raining wreckage and lives onto houses and streets. 270 people died. Residents on the ground, families heading home for Christmas, students, business travelers. In an instant, it became one of the most infamous terrorist attacks in aviation history. There was a time when Pan Am symbolized safety, modernity, American power. Now its logo was on twisted metal in a Scottish field broadcast into millions of homes. Investigators swarmed the wreckage, reconstructing the aircraft piece by piece in a hangar, tracing fragments of suitcase, wiring, and plastic. The conclusion: a bomb hidden in checked luggage. Attention turned toward Libya, its intelligence services, and a shadowy network of operatives, and at the same time toward Pan Am's own security. Because Pan Am had been cutting costs for years, its security procedures were an easy target. Outsourced screening, inconsistent baggage checks, warnings allegedly ignored or downplayed. The story that emerged was not just of a bomb, but of an airline whose defenses had been hollowed out by relentless financial pressure. It's an example of what happens when an empire built on glamour tries to save money in the least glamorous place, the checkpoints no one sees. Then came the legal avalanche. Families sued. Governments demanded answers. Insurance costs soared as underwriters reassessed the risk of flying with a brand now synonymous with Lockerbie. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed out in settlements, legal fees, and compensation. For a company already drowning in debt from fuel shocks, bad acquisitions, and that Heathrow sale, this wasn't a hit. It was a body blow. Passengers quietly shifted to rivals. Travel agents steered nervous customers elsewhere. Planes still took off with the blue globe on the tail, but the cabins felt emptier. The reputational damage cut even deeper than the balance sheet. His story is one of at times inspiring and at times chilling ambition, but Pan Am's life now looked fragile, even cursed. An airline once selling champagne at 35,000 feet was suddenly associated with funerals, courtrooms, and grainy news footage. The contrast was almost darkly comic. The company that taught the world to fly was now a case study in fear of flying. Lockerbie didn't, by itself, kill Pan Am. The airline was already staggering, but the bombing accelerated everything. Debt became more suffocating, turnaround plans more desperate, every bet more reckless. The question shifted from whether Pan Am could be saved to how long it could delay the inevitable, and what final sacrifice it would make to try. For the people in Pan Am uniforms, that final sacrifice wasn't a line on a balance sheet. It was their life, stitched into navy wool and pinned under a tiny blue globe. There was a time when walking through an airport in that uniform felt like wearing a crown. Captains in crisp caps, flight attendants in tailored suits, ground agents in perfect ties. Passengers stared, kids pointed, governments took meetings. Yet by the late 1980s, behind that polished image, the empire was running on fear, pay cuts, and whispered rumors at the crew lounge coffee machine. Let me take you back to a typical morning in 1988 at JFK. A 747 crew checks in for a flight to Paris, an iconic route that once screamed glamour and wealth. The captain signs the logbook, but beside the usual scribbles about fuel and weather, there's a new ritual. Scanning the bulletin board for bad news. Another route gone. Another temporary reduction in benefits. Another memo promising that this turnaround plan, finally, will work. Because of Pan Am's ruthless debt load and shrinking network, every month felt like a new amputation. Crews watched the route map, once wrapped confidently around the planet, recede like a tide. One week, a Berlin trip vanished. Another week, Rio. Flight attendants joked, quietly, that bidding for next month's schedule was like betting on a sinking ship's last dry deck. Operationally, the strain was everywhere. Aging 727s and 747s stayed in service longer than anyone had expected. Maintenance teams stretched parts inventories, deferred cosmetic fixes, and worked overtime to keep the aircraft safe and presentable on less and less money. Cabin crews knew which seats wouldn't recline, which galleys rattled, which overhead bins needed an extra shove. They were still expected to deliver world-class service, champagne smiles, and silver trays, while the company could barely afford the champagne. The emotional whiplash was brutal. One day, a flight to Tokyo, serving caviar at 35,000 feet, looking down at the Pacific like nothing in Pan Am's story had changed. The next day, reading headlines about layoffs, asset sales, and brutal court battles over who would carve up what remained. Paychecks arrived, but sometimes late. Pensions looked theoretical, yet the safety briefings stayed flawless, the announcements calm, the service polished. To passengers, the decline often looked invisible. To crews, it was written on every schedule change, and still, many believed. Pan Am was too famous, too strategic, too woven into America's projection of power to just disappear. Maybe a big merger, maybe a government rescue, maybe some last-minute white knight with enough money to keep the blue globe flying. By 1991, that faith would be tested in the most brutal way possible, on a single night when crews pushed back from the gate, climbed into the dark, and had no idea whether the company on their paychecks would still exist when they landed. On paper, that terrifying uncertainty had an answer. There was a time when Pan Am's survival wasn't supposed to depend on faith or miracles, but on a neat, clinical legal tool. Chapter 11. In January 1991, the empire that once drew the world's air routes by hand walked into a New York courtroom and admitted the obvious. Mountains of debt. Planes sold off. A global network hacked to pieces. The grand vision of Juan Tripa's world airline reduced to a bleeding stump that could no longer pay its bills. Chapter 11 wasn't liquidation. It was a plea for time, protection from creditors, and one last chance to prove that a smaller Pan Am could still make money. The plan sounded almost modest. shed the sprawling, money-losing transatlantic web. Abandon the fantasy of being everywhere for everyone. Rebuild around Miami as a fortress hub, pointing south instead of east, feeding Latin America and the Caribbean, where the blue globe still meant something. In theory, this was the logical adult response to decades of overreach. Cut the unprofitable routes, keep the ones that could be defended, and lean on the brand in markets where passengers still told family stories about their first Pan Am flight. But even a smaller airline needs fuel, crews, and, inconveniently, cash. Enter Delta. The upstart from Atlanta that had once watched Pan Am rule the skies now stepped forward as a would-be savior. Delta had already taken a huge slice of Pan Am's European routes and gates, especially at JFK, in a deal that gave it instant global reach. Now it agreed to inject tens of millions of dollars into the restructured Pan Am, take a stake in the new company, and feed traffic into Miami. The old flag carrier would shrink and survive. The rising southern powerhouse would get an instant international network. On the whiteboard, everyone won. Let me take you back to the internal logic. Pan Am would become a lean Latin America specialist. Delta would handle much of Europe. The two would interline, share passengers, and quietly divide up what had once been a single globe-spanning empire. It's an example of what happens when a fallen giant tries to live inside the shadow of its former life, trading glory for something more humble and, hopefully, profitable. But the whole structure was fragile, almost theatrical. The projections assumed steady fuel prices, a cooperative recession, and, above all, that Delta would keep writing checks. Any shock, any war, any spike in oil, and the math collapsed. When the Gulf War hit and demand sagged, those carefully drawn charts started to look like fiction. As fall turned to winter in 1991, the numbers stopped behaving. Losses piled up, load factors disappointed, and the cash burn looked less like a controlled restructuring and more like a bonfire. Delta's executives, who had once spoken the language of partnership, began talking about exposure and limits. Their patience thinned. Their money followed. Behind the scenes, the conversation around Pan Am quietly shifted. The question was no longer whether the airline could be saved, but exactly when the plug would be pulled, and who would be on board when the lights finally went out. The quiet shift in language at Delta turned into something louder inside Pan Am, not in press releases or glossy ads, but in the places where the airline's real life played out: crew rooms, ticket counters, payroll offices that suddenly started locking their doors. There was a time when a Pan Am ID badge was a passport to glamour and security. In late November 1991, it started to feel like a name tag on a sinking ship. Let me take you back to those last days. Memos began to circulate, printed on the same blue and white letterhead that once announced new routes to Paris or Tokyo. Only now, the subject lines read, cash flow constraints, temporary delays, non-essential expenditures. Paychecks that had always arrived like clockwork showed up late, or in two parts, or with quiet instructions to hold off cashing until Monday. Flight attendants compared bank balances the way they used to compare layover hotels. Because of that tightening money and the ruthless arithmetic of bankruptcy court, the front line became a stage for denial. At check-in desks, agents smiled and reassured nervous passengers that yes, their Christmas flights would operate. Yes, Pan Am was committed to its schedule. Then, on break, those same agents ducked into back offices to call union reps, to ask friends at American or United whether they were hiring, to whisper, "Have you heard anything concrete?" The official story was survival. The private story was exit strategy. Behind them, In conference rooms that never closed, the legal and financial tipping point was taking shape. Delta, already burned by pouring hundreds of millions into someone else's collapsing empire, began pulling back support. Credit lines shrank. Judges who had once stretched deadlines started talking about fiduciary duty and creditor rights. Emergency meetings stretched late into the night, lawyers and bankers moving model airplanes around a table not to plan new routes, but to decide which assets could be sold before the whole thing turned to dust. Yet out on the ramp, Pan Am still looked immortal. 747s in that iconic blue globe livery pushed back on time. Gate agents called boarding groups. In first class, champagne still flowed into real glass. Flight attendants still recited the same polished welcome that had greeted heads of state and movie stars. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling. A ritual of wealth and power continuing as if the empire were not already in receivership. Because the collapse of a giant rarely arrives with a single dramatic announcement, it arrives as a series of small, quiet decisions. On December 3rd, behind closed doors, those decisions finally aligned. Delta's patience was gone, the judge's optimism was gone, and the numbers made one thing brutally clear: Pan Am would not survive another week. The airline's fate was sealed, but thousands of employees and tens of thousands of passengers planning to fly under that blue globe still woke up the next morning believing the story wasn't over. On the morning of December 4th, 1991, Pan Am still looked alive. Jets were fueling, crews were checking in, passengers were lining up under that glowing blue globe. There was a time when that logo meant certainty, connection, America. By that afternoon, it meant nothing. Inside a Manhattan courtroom, the last illusion vanished. The bankruptcy judge reviewed the cash, the Delta lifeline that never came, the mounting losses, and issued the order: cease operations. Not next month, not next week. Now. Because the empire was out of money, the shutdown had to be ruthless, immediate, and global. Within minutes, the decision rippled out over phone lines and telex machines to every corner of Pan Am's world. At JFK's Worldport, supervisors got the call, scribbled notes, and walked back into the terminal carrying a sentence no one wanted to say out loud. At Miami, Frankfurt, Heathrow, Tokyo, the same quiet choreography began. Managers huddling, agents staring, radios crackling with half-finished instructions. Then the public address systems came alive. "Attention, please. Pan Am regrets to announce." Voices shook as they read the script. Counters that had been open for 60 years began closing in seconds. Computer screens went dark. The famous blue ticket jackets in people's hands were still warm from the printer, but they were already worthless. Passengers found out mid-journey that their story had changed. Families landing in New York from London discovered their connecting Pan Am flight to Chicago did not exist anymore. Honeymooners bound for the Caribbean were told the airline they were flying on had just died. Some argued, some pleaded, some laughed in disbelief at the idea that a company that helped invent the jet age could simply evaporate between gate changes. Behind the counters, the reaction was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Gate agents processed what they were told would be the last departures, printing boarding passes through tears, tagging bags with a logo that had just become a relic. On the ramp, mechanics watched 727s and 747s taxi out, knowing they might never see those aircraft return to a Pan Am gate. For many, this wasn't just a job. This was the life they had built, the family they had chosen, disappearing in real time. The shutdown triggered a frantic logistical scramble. Other airlines stepped in, some honoring Pan Am tickets as a gesture of solidarity or public relations, shuttling stranded travelers onto whatever empty seats they had left. Government agencies leaned on carriers, coordinated with foreign regulators, trying to prevent thousands from sleeping on terminal floors. Overseas stations were hit hardest. In places like Nairobi or Karachi, the only message was, "Stop selling, stop checking in, wait for instructions that arrived late or not at all." Yet even as counters went dark, a final complication was already in the sky. Pan Am still had aircraft airborne when the order came down. Those flights were now heading toward an airline that no longer existed, and their last approach would turn into something no one had planned: a farewell tour for a fallen empire. One of those unplanned farewell tours was somewhere high over the Atlantic when the death sentence came through as a line of text. On Pan Am Flight 3 from Frankfurt to New York, the captain was settling into routine cruise, fuel checks, oceanic position reports, the quiet rhythm that had once made this airline feel immortal. Then a telex clattered in from company dispatch. The bankruptcy judge had ruled. The money was gone. Operations would cease that day. In a few flat sentences, an empire that had drawn the first jet-age map of the world was finished. There was a time when a message from Pan Am Dispatch meant a schedule change, a weather warning, an extra VIP in first class. Now it meant extinction. The captain read it once, then again, then handed it to his first officer without a word. In the galley, flight attendants who had grown up dreaming of the Blue Globe logo heard the news over the interphone and went silent. Some had given their entire working life to this company. Others had just escaped poverty in small towns or foreign cities through the promise of flying. All of them suddenly realized they were on a living airline that would land as a ghost. Shock came first, then something harder to describe. Call it grief mixed with professional pride. Because of that pride, service did not fall apart. It intensified. Coffee was topped up more often. Champagne was poured a little higher. Announcements were delivered with perfect calm. If this was going to be the last transatlantic crossing in Pan Am colors for some of them, it would not be sloppy. As word spread through the cabin, passengers reacted in waves. A businessman in a rumpled suit refused to believe it, explaining to anyone who would listen that a company this famous could not just vanish between time zones. A family returning from Europe started taking photos of everything: the headrest covers, the safety card, the cabin crew lined up in the aisle. Others simply stared at the logo on the bulkhead, realizing in real time that they were watching the end of an era that had once made flying feel like entry into a private club of wealth and power. The landings that day were normal on paper and anything but normal in life. In New York, in Miami, in London, aircraft rolled out, turned off the runway, and were met by fire trucks forming impromptu honor guards. Water cannon arced over 747s and A310s in improvised state funerals for a private company. Inside, there was spontaneous applause mixed with tears, a strange, quiet clapping that sounded less like celebration and more like goodbye. When those engines finally spooled down and the seatbelt signs went off, it was not just the end of a flight. It was the last page of a 64-year story about American ambition in the sky, at times inspiring and at times chilling. And the way that story ended would say as much about changing American power as the way it began. There was a time when that blue globe on a tail fin looked permanent, like the flag on an embassy. Then, in one night, it became something you could fold, hang, or throw away. As the last passengers filed off and the jet bridge door clicked shut, crews walked down the corridor carrying uniforms. They suddenly weren't sure they still worked in. A flight attendant who had crossed oceans for 20 years drove home in the dark, hung her Pan Am uniform in the closet out of habit, then froze. The wings on the lapel still caught the light. The ID badge on her lanyard still had clearance codes and airport stamps, but by sunrise, that badge would open exactly nothing. Across the empire, that was the pattern. Captains who had once walked through terminals like minor royalty now placed their caps on kitchen tables and stared at mortgage bills. Mechanics clocked out, pocketed their metal ID tags, and understood that decades of seniority had evaporated in a single announcement. Careers that had started with flying boats and the jet age ended with a fax from bankruptcy court. Let me take you back to the physical body of Pan Am, because it did not die cleanly. The aircraft, those gleaming 747s that had once symbolized American power, were suddenly just collateral. Lessors repossessed them under harsh fluorescent hangar lights. Others were sold off at discount, their Pan Am titles scrubbed with solvent and paint, the blue globe sanded away so another logo could claim the metal. Inside corporate offices, the transformation was even more blunt. Desks, chairs, and filing cabinets went to auction, tagged with masking tape and lot numbers. Conference tables where Juan Tripe's successors had once negotiated with presidents and dictators were now just office furniture, mixed condition. Some things never made it to the auction block. A gate agent quietly slipped a departure board placard with the Pan Am logo into her tote bag. A reservations clerk took home a stack of unused ticket jackets, blue and white, good for flights that would never exist. Out at JFK, a mechanic drove past a hangar that had always been lit, always humming, and saw it dark for the first time in his adult life. The silence felt louder than any engine. For many in that world, Pan Am was not just a job, it was a life script. The uniform decided where they lived, when they saw family, how they measured wealth and time. It told them they were part of something bigger than themselves, a flying expression of American reach. When that vanished, the psychological whiplash was brutal. Who are you when the logo that defined your days is suddenly in a landfill, under broken plastic and rainwater? Because this is not only a story about one airline's balance sheet. It's an example of what happens when an institution that once projected national prestige turns out to be fragile, exposed, vulnerable. The physical airline is gone, scattered into closets, auctions, and scrapyards. The deeper question now is the one that really matters. How did something so powerful fall apart so completely? And what changed in America that made its collapse almost inevitable? There was a time when Pan Am didn't just carry passengers, it carried the flag. Not in a symbolic way on a tail fin, but in the very real sense that presidents, generals, and diplomats treated the airline as an arm of American power. Let me take you back to the decades when that relationship looked like a golden ticket. When Washington wanted to open a new route over some wary foreign capital, Pan Am executives were in the room, sitting almost shoulder to shoulder with State Department officials. Bilateral air treaties were drawn up where Pan Am's interests and America's interests were written in the same sentences and often in the same breath. During World War II, Pan Am's clippers ferried personnel, mail, and equipment across oceans that the military could barely reach. In the Cold War, its planes carried envoys, evacuated families, and quietly supported covert logistics. The company trained foreign national airlines, advised governments on aviation policy, and in return, it received something every rival envied: preferential access to international routes and the aura of being the chosen instrument of the United States. For a long time, that aura felt like armor. If competition threatened, there was always the assumption that regulators would tilt the field, that treaties would be written in a way that preserved Pan Am's empire in the skies. When the Civil Aeronautics Board controlled who could fly where, Pan Am's life looked protected, insulated from the raw, ruthless chaos of open markets. But protection has a hidden cost. It breeds the quiet belief that the referee will always step in. While domestic carriers like American United and Delta were slugging it out on price, service, and efficiency. Inside the United States, Pan Am lived mostly offshore in a curated world of international prestige, government dinners, and negotiated privileges. It's an example of what happens when power feels permanent, urgency fades, and bad habits can hide behind the flag. Then deregulation hit. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the rules changed from who has the right to who can survive. The US government stepped back from picking national champions and let the market decide winners and losers. Foreign governments, watching their own carriers grow, were less interested in giving Pan Am a free pass as the American favorite. The shield that had once guaranteed routes now looked suspiciously like dead weight. Pan Am's rivals came into this new era battle-hardened. They had grown up in a domestic arena where every route could be contested, every fare could be undercut, and every inefficiency could be punished. They had hubs, frequent flyer programs, aggressive yield management, and a culture tuned to shave costs and chase customers relentlessly. Pan Am, by contrast, carried a heavy legacy and an expensive global footprint. Its story is one of prestige colliding with a world that no longer paid extra for it. The airline was slow to slash overhead, slow to build dense domestic networks, slow to pivot from diplomatic glamour to customer-focused agility. When the referee left the field, the game didn't pause, it accelerated, and Pan Am was still looking toward Washington for help that would finally never come. In the end, its intimacy with national power had trained it to negotiate, not to adapt, to lobby, not to reinvent. And in a deregulated sky, that was a fatal difference. In that new world, Pan Am's real weakness finally stepped into the spotlight. It had been built for scale, not for survival. Not only was it the airline that launched the jet age, it was the airline that kept doubling down, taking bigger swings, tying its life to assets that looked like power and turned out to be handcuffs. There was a time when that strategy looked untouchable. Let me take you back to the flying boats of the 1930s, the clippers that hopped oceans from bespoke island bases and private terminals. Those weren't just planes. They were floating palaces that required special docks, maintenance crews, and routes only Pan Am could use. The pattern started there. Giant bets on bespoke hardware and custom-built infrastructure, all premised on endless growth and a world that would always bend around the empire. Then came the 707 deal, the moment Pan Am more or less dragged commercial aviation into the jet age. Juan Trippe ordered jets in bulk before most airlines had even decided whether they wanted them. Later, he repeated the move with the 747, betting that the future belonged to huge aircraft funneling oceans of passengers through a few global gateways. Worldport at JFK, with its sweeping overhang and dedicated Pan Am gates, was the physical expression of that bet. It screamed money, prestige, inevitability. But behind the glamour was something colder: operational leverage. When an airline owns giant planes, iconic terminals, and far-flung bases, most of its costs are fixed. The fuel bill moves, the catering moves, but the debt payments, the leases, the salaries, the maintenance on a 747 that has to fly full just to break even, those do not. In boom times, that leverage is magic. Every extra passenger is almost pure profit. In a downturn, every empty seat is a little hole in the hull, and Pan Am had built an entire fleet of ships that could not afford to sail half full. As deregulation and fuel shocks hit, a new generation of rivals chose a different playbook. They chased fleet commonality instead of variety, flying mostly one or two models to simplify training, maintenance, and parts. They optimized hubs, not monuments, turning ordinary airports into efficient transfer machines. Routes were no longer about flags on a map. They were about ruthless profitability analysis, cut or reworked the moment the numbers went red. It was less romantic, less imperial, and far more resilient. Pan Am went the other way. The National Airlines acquisition was meant to fix the one thing it never had: a strong domestic network. Instead, it bolted a mismatched fleet, overlapping routes, and fresh debt onto an already strained balance sheet. Worldport, once a symbol of arrival, became an aging asset that soaked up cash. Flagship routes that had once signaled dominance now bled money in a world where passengers suddenly cared more about price than about whether their ticket carried a blue globe. His story is one of relentless expansion. Pan Am's is one of relentless escalation. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when size is mistaken for safety, when prestige projects are treated as armor instead of anchors. Because if an airline that powerful could misread scale so badly, the real question hangs over the present. Which modern empires, in tech, in finance, in media, are quietly making the same bet right now? And how will everyone find out when their night finally comes? Because the strange thing was, from the outside, Pan Am didn't look like a dying empire at all. The night the numbers turned red, the blue globe still glowed on tail fins from Frankfurt to Tokyo, a floating promise that America was on time, in charge, and in control of the skies. There was a time when that logo was more than marketing. It was a passport. In the 1960s and 70s, if a stranger in Nairobi or Berlin saw that blue sphere, they thought safety, American money, a certain glamorous idea of Western life. Even as debt piled up from 747 orders and bad acquisitions, passengers still walked down the jet bridge, saw the globe, and relaxed. The balance sheet was screaming. The brand whispered, "Everything's fine." That mismatch is where the danger really lived. Strong brands don't just sell tickets, they sedate fear. Banks extended credit because Pan Am was Pan Am, the unofficial flag carrier that had once negotiated with presidents and dictators. Governments delayed hard decisions, partners renewed contracts, lessors rolled over terms, all assuming this airline was too iconic to fail. Each extension was small, rational, temporary. Together, they formed a long, slow lifeline that kept the body moving while the vital organs failed. Inside the company, the illusion went even deeper. Many employees had built entire lives around that globe, passing jobs from parent to child like a family heirloom. For them, his story is one of loyalty, not leverage ratios. Flight attendants who had served champagne to movie stars, mechanics who had watched the first 707s arrive, mid-level managers who had seen Pan Am survive fuel crises and hijackings, all quietly believed the same thing. Someone powerful would step in. A white knight buyer. A last-minute merger. A government that remembered how Pan Am had carried troops and diplomats when it mattered. Executives weren't immune either. Some clung to the idea that the brand itself was an asset so valuable that it guaranteed a rescue price. After all, how could Washington let the world's most recognizable airline vanish? It's an example of what happens when prestige becomes a kind of internal propaganda, when leaders start reading the logo as a guarantee rather than a question. Meanwhile, competitors read the situation with far less emotion and far more ruthlessness. They didn't want the globe. They wanted the map behind it. As Pan Am staggered, rivals quietly bought its London Heathrow slots, its transatlantic routes, its Pacific network. They copied pieces of its aesthetic, the clean blue lines, the international mystique, while letting Pan Am absorb the reputational blast from Lockerbie and other crises. The brand that once shielded the company now drew fire, concentrating public anger on a name that was already running out of cash. Let me take you back to that final phase with a different lens. The brand did work. It bought time. It delayed panic. It softened the stampede of creditors and kept doors open that would have slammed shut on a smaller name. But time, misused, turns from asset to weapon. When fundamentals don't change, a powerful brand doesn't prevent the fall. It stretches it, dragging more employees, more families, and more wealth down when the night finally comes. Time can be a lifeline, or it can be a mirror. For Pan Am, all that borrowed time didn't just delay the impact, it magnified a deeper problem. The airline still believed it ruled an empire that no longer existed. There was a time when the blue globe on a tail wasn't just a logo, it was a royal seal. Inside the company, that royalty was taken seriously. Pan Am's culture was aristocratic and top-down, forged in the years when presidents called Juan Tripa, not the other way around. Captains were sky gods, managers were company men, and orders flowed one way, from the top deck down. Decision-making moved through layers of hierarchy, slow and ceremonious, as if the airline were still the chosen instrument of American power, rather than a business fighting for survival in a deregulated market. That hierarchy carried something else: nostalgia. Let me take you back to the flying boat era, when clippers skimmed across oceans with white-gloved service, silver trays, and ticket prices that only the global elite could afford. That memory lived on in the halls at Pan Am headquarters, in training manuals, in the way flight attendants were selected and groomed. The jet age only intensified it. First 707s, then the debut of the 747, champagne in real glass, spiral staircases to upper deck lounges. His story is one of luxury turned into identity. Pan Am didn't just sell seats, it sold a story about wealth and glamour at 30,000 feet. But when deregulation unleashed no-frills rivals, that story became a trap. While upstarts stripped out meals, packed cabins, and chased volume with ruthless efficiency, Pan Am clung to full-service, long-haul prestige. Cutting costs felt like sacrilege. Shrinking legroom or trimming cabin crew clashed with the internal myth of what Pan Am was. It's an example of what happens when a brand becomes a belief system. Reality changes, but doctrine doesn't. That mindset showed up in the pivots Pan Am missed. Other carriers embraced hub-and-spoke networks, turning places like Atlanta and Dallas into profit machines, sweating every connection. Pan Am, with New York and a scattering of international gateways, was slow to re-optimize its routes for the new math. There was a time when the airline could avoid messy domestic routes and live almost entirely on glamorous international flying. By the time it pushed harder into the US market, buying national airlines in 1980, the move was late, expensive, and poorly integrated. Technology told the same story. Competitors poured money into yield management systems that treated every seat like a fluctuating asset, adjusting fares in real time. Pan Am underinvested, relying too long on old pricing habits, handshake deals, and intuition. From veterans who knew their markets. In an industry where pennies per mile decide life or death, that kind of faith was costly. And then there were the people. Pan Am's workforce was proud, unionized, and protected by legacy contracts written for a world of steady growth and government-shaped routes. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crews had fought hard for pay scales and work rules that made sense when the airline was printing prestige. Management, under pressure from creditors, pushed for concessions. Unions, scarred by years of mistrust and feeling the ground shifting under their lives, dug in. Every proposed restructuring wasn't just a spreadsheet exercise, it was a political battle and an emotional betrayal. Because of that mutual distrust, cuts came late and in painful bursts instead of early and strategic. Layoffs landed like ambushes. Morale curdled. The people who had once been the face of American air power now watched their empire crumble from the inside, and many blamed the other side of the table more than the market outside the windows. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Pan Am's inner life shows that the real turbulence wasn't only in the fuel prices or the balance sheet, it was in the stories the company told itself. If this downfall was as much about mindset as markets, what does that say about other institutions still running on stories written for a different world? There was a time when stepping into an international terminal meant stepping into Pan Am's living room. The blue globe sat over the check-in counters like a royal seal. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the guests began rearranging the furniture. As Pan Am argued with itself and with gravity, United, American, Delta, and a wave of foreign carriers were watching. They had studied Pan Am's glory years, the way generals study an old campaign map. United bulked up on domestic power, then lunged for the crown jewel, London Heathrow. When Pan Am, drowning in debt, agreed in 1990 to sell its Heathrow routes and slots to United, it wasn't just a transaction, it was a transfer of identity. The airport that had once been Pan Am's front door to Europe now echoed with United announcements and red, white, and blue tails that were not Pan Am's. Delta moved with the quiet confidence of a rival who had waited a very long time. Let me take you back to the early 1990s. Pan Am had built Miami into the gateway to Latin America, the southern capital of its empire. But when finances collapsed, Delta swooped in, buying key European routes and large pieces of the Miami hub operation. Gates, lounges, even some employees changed badges. The physical skeleton of Pan Am's global network stayed in place, but the nervous system belonged to someone else. Across the Atlantic, British Airways and Lufthansa did something more subtle and, in some ways, more ruthless. They took Pan Am's playbook, crossed out the most reckless pages, and ran it better. Pan Am had pioneered global branding, turning its name into shorthand for air travel itself. BA doubled down on that idea with the world's favorite airline, while Lufthansa polished a reputation for German precision. Pan Am had experimented with alliances and interline deals. These carriers would help turn those experiments into the formal alliances that dominate aviation today. Even the frequent flyer program, a quiet revolution in money and loyalty that Pan Am helped normalize, became a weapon used against it. Competitors refined mileage schemes, tied them to banks and credit cards, and locked in customers for life. Pan Am, short on cash and long on obligations, could not match the generosity. Because of its own earlier innovations, passengers now had reasons to stay loyal to airlines that were not loyal to Pan Am. The symbolism shifted city by city. Where once a single blue globe had marked the American gateway to the world, now a patchwork of tails took turns carrying the flag into markets Pan Am had opened. United at Heathrow, Delta in Miami, and across the Atlantic, BA and Lufthansa on routes that had once been Pan Am's proudest trophies. His story is one of power built through innovation and then quietly redistributed through contracts, auctions, and slot trades rather than dramatic knockouts. In the end, Pan Am's empire wasn't toppled in a single war. It was dismantled piece by piece, flight by flight, often by former partners and domestic rivals it had barely acknowledged in its heyday. It's an example of what happens when an institution teaches the world how to fly, but not how to survive the world it created. And the final blows were delivered not by enemies at the gate, but by successors walking calmly through it. And on the other side of that gate were the people who had built their lives around the blue globe without ever working for it. There was a time when a certain kind of traveler did not say, "I'm flying to London." They said, "I'm going Pan Am to London." Executives with permanent jet lag, diplomats with red passports, military families rotating between bases in Germany and Guam. Pan Am was not a choice. It was the default setting for an international life. For them, stepping into a 747 at JFK felt less like boarding a plane and more like entering a moving embassy of American power. Let me take you back to the late 1970s. A sales director from Chicago flies to Tokyo 4 times a year. He knows the pursers by name, knows which upper deck seats have just enough legroom to sleep, knows the exact moment, somewhere over Alaska, when the cabin lights dim and the caviar appears. His story is one of habit hardening into loyalty. He collects paper boarding passes, not miles. The reward is predictability, not points. Then, slowly, the machine he trusts begins to fray. The same passenger, a decade later, notices that the once pristine cabin feels tired. Overhead, bins rattle. Seat fabrics don't match. A flight to Frankfurt leaves an hour late, then 3 hours late, then canceled entirely. Champagne still appears, but the bottle is poured more cautiously, the smiles a little thinner. On some routes, the legendary Pan Am girl glamour has been replaced by a weary, understaffed crew racing to meet schedules that no longer quite hold. Meanwhile, rivals are quietly weaponizing loyalty in a new way. American, United, British Airways roll out frequent flyer programs and alliances, not just handing out miles, but building entire ecosystems of money, perks, and status. Because of those programs, passengers who once swore they would never abandon the blue globe now run the numbers. Double miles on a competitor. Guaranteed upgrades. Lounge access that actually works when a flight melts down. It's an example of what happens when emotional loyalty collides with mathematical incentives. By 1991, many of those same travelers are still booking Pan Am out of habit, out of nostalgia, out of a vague sense of duty to a fallen empire. Then, one December morning, they arrive at the airport, and the counter is closed for good. Tickets are suddenly worthless. Families headed to Christmas in Paris are herded toward Delta or United desks. Suit-wearing road warriors are rebooked onto Lufthansa or Air France. And something strange happens. The replacement flights take off on time. The seats are fine. The world does not end. Within months, the Blue Globe logo becomes a story people tell, not a service they use. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, the speed of that forgetting raises an uncomfortable question. If millions could move on from Pan Am that fast, what does that say about the durability of any corporate legend? And what happens when the next icon discovers its passengers have already emotionally disembarked? So when the planes stop flying, the story doesn't. It just moves somewhere softer, safer, into the background of other people's lives. There was a time when you could watch a movie set in the 60s, and, without fail, a blue globe would float through the frame. On a stewardess bag slung over an actress's shoulder, on a departures board, on a tiny pin catching the light. Directors know that logo does instant work. One shot of a Pan Am carry-on tossed onto a hotel bed, a recreated 707 cabin with wide seats and wood veneer, a vintage travel poster on a brick apartment wall, and the audience fills in the rest. Glamour. Champagne. The empire of the jet age humming in the background. The airline that no longer exists still books a supporting role again and again. In 2011, that nostalgia finally got top billing. The TV series Pan Am promised viewers the life behind the uniform: young flight attendants, Cold War intrigue, romance at 35,000 feet. The sets were meticulous, the costumes flawless, the lighting permanently golden. Hijackings, fuel crises, and a looming bankruptcy existed, but as stylish plot devices, not existential threats. Terrorism was suspense. It was not Lockerbie. Financial collapse was tension. It was not thousands of jobs evaporating overnight. This is what nostalgia does. It compresses history into a highlight reel, preserving the golden age aesthetic while blurring the messy realities underneath. Labor disputes that dragged on for months become a single tense conversation. Deadly accidents turn into a line of dialogue and a somber music cue. Strategic blunders that bled money for years are reduced to a troubled look from an executive staring out a rain-soaked window. Then, pattern interrupt. Walk into a small aviation museum or a collector's home, and Pan Am hasn't died at all. Glass cases hold menus printed for steak and lobster at altitude, ashtrays with the Globe logo, paper timetables mapping a world the airline once claimed as its own. Uniforms line the walls like military dress, each decade's cut and color reflecting a different phase of American confidence. For the people who hunt these relics, this isn't just corporate branding. It's a lost ritual from a time when flying felt like a special occasion, not a commute. Because of that, the Pan Am most people remember is curated, edited, airbrushed. It's a mood more than a company, a floating symbol of mid-century wealth and power that has slipped free from the hard lessons of its demise. And it's an example of what happens when a brand becomes myth. The logo survives. The warning label doesn't. Let me take you back to the years when that myth was still being written, and the decisions that would, quietly, make it necessary. There was a time when seeing that blue globe meant you were going somewhere important. New York, Paris, Tokyo, the front row of the jet age. After December 1991, it meant something else, an asset to be liquidated. When Pan Am died, its routes were carved up, its aircraft scattered, its people sent home. But the name, the trademarks, the globe itself, those could still be sold. Investors stepped in, convinced that if they could just strap that logo onto a new machine, the old magic would return. His story is one of glamour. Theirs would be about money, timing, and a brutal reminder that nostalgia doesn't pay fuel bills. Let me take you back to the mid-1990s. A group of backers bought the Pan Am name out of bankruptcy court and launched what the press quickly called Pan Am 2. Not a global empire with 747s and first-class lounges, but a small, low-cost carrier flying turboprops and aging narrow-bodies between secondary cities. Instead of JFK to Heathrow, think small Florida airports to the northeast, odd point-to-point routes, and discount fares that had more in common with a bus ticket than the old Clipper service. On paper, the plan sounded clever. Use a world-famous brand to stand out in the brutal post-deregulation chaos. In practice, the gap between name and substance was enormous. The new Pan Am had no inherited route network, no transatlantic rights, no government backing, and nowhere near the capital reserves that had once let Juan Trippe gamble on the 707 and the 747. Because of that lack of money and leverage, the airline was trapped in the least forgiving corner of aviation: low margin, high cost, brutally competitive short-haul flying. Passengers would show up, see that iconic globe on the tail, and then climb the stairs to a cramped, no-frills cabin. No piano bar, no silver service, just plastic seats and tight legroom. It created a strange cognitive dissonance. The livery whispered mid-century wealth and power. The reality screamed regional carrier. Seeing Pan Am parked at small, anonymous terminals instead of the great global gateways was like finding a fallen monarch working the night shift at a strip mall. It wasn't just one attempt. Pan Am 2 collapsed, then another iteration tried again, and again the same forces crushed it. Thin capitalization, no scale, a brand that promised the world but delivered a coupon fare. Each failure made something clear. The logo was famous, but it was famous for a business model that no longer existed. So the blue globe migrated onto t-shirts and weekender bags, onto retro posters, themed airport lounges, even a short-lived rail service that ran Pan Am Railways locomotives through New England. The name became a costume for experiences that sold the fantasy of the jet age without the risk of actually running an airline. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, it turned Pan Am into an aesthetic more than a company. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If you can sell the logo without the planes, if the empire can live on as decor while the airline itself lies in the grave, then what was Pan Am in the end? A serious national project, a ruthless business, or just a beautifully packaged story waiting to be franchised? Because Pan Am feels so singular, it is tempting to treat its collapse as a one-off aviation tragedy, a freak accident in corporate life. But let me take you back to a pattern that shows up again and again, in cameras, in phones, in cars, in every empire that thought it was untouchable. There was a time when Kodak owned memory itself. It printed family vacations, weddings, wars. Nokia owned the phone in your pocket. General Motors, before its own near death, owned the American road. Each one was woven into national identity, held up as proof of ingenuity and power, wrapped in flags and advertising. Pan Am was the same in the sky. The blue globe on the tail might as well have been a passport stamp that said United States. But that is where the danger begins. When an empire's early advantages are so overwhelming that they feel permanent, leaders start to manage the past instead of inventing the future. Kodak clung to film while it literally held the patents for digital. Nokia kept doubling down on hardware while software quietly ate the world. GM kept feeding sprawling dealer networks and gas-hungry cars while the oil crises were screaming that the game was changing. Pan Am kept betting on bigger jets, grander terminals, and political influence, while deregulation, fuel prices, and new competitors rewrote the rules underneath it. In each case, the same reflex appeared: protect the legacy, protect the routes, the film margins, the market share. Cultures that once rewarded experimentation began rewarding caretakers. Managers learned how to defend turf, not question sacred metrics. Load factors, yields, market dominance, numbers that made perfect sense in a regulated cheap-fuel jet age, became comforting illusions once oil spiked and ticket prices were freed to fall. That is how success creates its own blind spots. The mental models that built the empire become the bars of the cage. If the 747 made Pan Am rich, then more capacity must be the answer. If first-class glamour sold the story, then double down on glamour. It's an example of what happens when yesterday's victories are treated as a playbook instead of a warning label. Then come the shocks. For GM, it was the oil embargo and foreign competition. For Kodak, the digital camera. For Nokia, the iPhone. For Pan Am, the oil crises, deregulation, and finally terrorism. Lockerbie turning a proud brand into a nightly headline of fear. These were not the root causes. They were accelerants poured on dry timber that had been stacking up for years. His story is one of gradual decay, followed by sudden collapse, and Pan Am fits the same grim rhythm. The fall of a giant rarely begins with the headline event. It begins in boardrooms, in assumptions, in the quiet years when change looks optional. The end only feels sudden because the rest of us were not watching the slow part. And that slow part, the years when the warning lights flashed and were ignored, is where the real lesson hides. Those warning lights didn't just flash for Pan Am. They flashed for an entire way of organizing the skies. There was a time when one logo could stand in for a nation, when a blue globe on a tail fin felt like a passport and a promise. After Pan Am's fall, that idea didn't just wobble, it fractured. Into the cracks flowed something new. Instead of one empire in the air, there were alliances. Star Alliance in 1997, One World in 1999, SkyTeam in 2000. Loose federations of airlines that, together, recreated what Pan Am once did alone. Shared lounges, coordinated schedules, round-the-world tickets stitched from half a dozen carriers. On paper, it looked tidy. In real life, it meant a passenger could leave São Paulo on one airline, cross the Atlantic on another, and land in Delhi on a third, never leaving the same booking code. The globe was still connected, just no longer by a single hand. For the United States, the vacuum was filled not by a new champion, but by a committee. Delta, United, American, each one aggressive, each one hungry, none with the singular myth Pan Am carried. They bought routes, merged with rivals, and slowly built long-haul networks that reached the same cities Pan Am had once treated as its private living room. New York to London, Atlanta to Tokyo, Chicago to Frankfurt. The map refilled line by line. The money and power were still there, but the symbolism was diluted. No child taped a single airline's timetable over the bed and thought, "That's my country's wings." Meanwhile, the center of gravity moved. Let me take you back to the 1960s, when almost every glamorous route seemed to arc between North America and Western Europe. By the 2000s, that axis had shifted. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi rose from the desert as 24-hour global crossroads. Singapore, Hong Kong, Seoul, and later Beijing turned into mega-hubs where East met West, South, and everything in between. Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Etihad built long-haul webs that funneled passengers through the Gulf. Asian giants did the same across the Pacific. The story of global aviation was no longer written exclusively in English and French. It now spoke Arabic, Chinese, Korean. All of this was made possible by deregulation and open skies agreements. When governments loosened control over routes and fares, when bilateral deals gave airlines freedom to fly where demand existed, the old idea of a single, protected flag carrier began to look quaint. In its place emerged a dense, shifting network of competitors and partners, low-cost disruptors at the bottom, prestige brands at the top, alliances knitting them into something that looked coherent from 35,000 feet. Which raises an uncomfortable question. In a world of alliances, code shares, and budget cabins, could a Pan Am-style global flag carrier ever rise again? Or was its life not just a story from the past, but a model the industry has quietly buried? The answer lies in who tried to copy Pan Am's ambition and what it cost them. Those who tried to copy Pan Am didn't disappear. Many of them run the skies today. Not just one empire now, but clusters of them. Gulf superconnectors, European holding companies, American giants that span a continent with their logos and their debt. There was a time when one blue globe hinted at American power on every departure board. Now that glow is fractured into Emirates in Dubai, Qatar Airways in Doha, Etihad down the road, the Lufthansa Group knitting together Germany, Switzerland, Austria, IAG holding British Airways and Iberia in one financial family, and the US Big Three, Delta, United American, quietly moving hundreds of millions of lives a year. Different brands, same dream, scale, reach, and the feeling that if you control the hubs, you control the world. Look at the Gulf carriers. Emirates building a palace in the desert, turning Dubai into a 24-hour switching station between continents. Qatar buying World Cup prestige, sponsorships, and a fleet that makes economy feel like an afterthought. These airlines are not just companies. They are instruments of national strategy, backed by oil money, royal favor, and long planning horizons. Let me take you back to Pan Am's early days, when Washington handed it route rights as if they were diplomatic concessions. That blessing felt permanent too, until politics changed. State backing is a gift with a timer hidden inside. It can fund wide bodies, absorb losses, and intimidate rivals, but it can also tempt leaders into ignoring market signals, overbuilding capacity, and assuming that prestige will always outrun profit. Sanctions, regional crises, a shift in how voters feel about subsidies, any of these can turn a golden pipeline of support into a slow leak. It's an example of what happens when an airline confuses being useful to a government with being untouchable. And then there are the new emperors that never sell a single ticket. Airbus and Boeing, dueling over the next long-haul design. Global distribution systems and booking platforms that decide what flights you even see. Frequent flyer programs that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, behave more like banks than travel clubs. Pan Am once told Boeing what to build and where the world wanted to go. Now, mega carriers wait in line for delivery slots, while algorithmic platforms nudge passengers toward whoever pays for prominence. The question is resilience. When a pandemic erases demand overnight, when regulators ground a new jet, when a video of one ugly incident ricochets around social media in an hour, how many of today's giants are truly prepared? Not on paper, not in glossy sustainability reports, but in cash, flexibility, and humility. Because his story is one of illusions, the illusion that being central to a system means being safe from its storms. Pan Am's fall shows that even a world airline can be treated like any other failing business once the political wind shifts and the balance sheet breaks. That lesson doesn't belong to a lost jet age. It hangs over every hub, every app, every modern empire that believes the network needs it too much to let it die. There was a time when Pan Am's Blue Globe didn't just decorate airports, it crowned an empire. The airline's rise is usually told as a glamorous success story, but look closer, and it becomes something else. A story of ambition with no exit ramp, expansion with no plan for what happens when the world changes its mind. From 1927 mail runs to flying boats landing like ocean liners in Lisbon and Manila, to the 707 deal that launched the jet age, Pan Am lived to get bigger. More routes, larger aircraft, grander terminals, deeper ties to presidents and generals. Growth wasn't a phase in its life. Growth was its identity. No one wrote a playbook for what to do when the fuel crises hit, when deregulation slashed fares, when the 747s that once symbolized wealth started taking off half-empty. That blind spot isn't unique. Companies and nations design for conquest, not retreat. They draw up 5-year plans for market share, for GDP, for fleet size, but almost never for how to shrink on purpose without humiliation. When the only acceptable direction is up, any move to the side, any step back, feels like failure instead of adaptation. It's an example of what happens when a system confuses size with life itself. Pan Am could have sold aircraft earlier, spun off routes, become a leaner international specialist. Instead, it clung to scale and prestige, still talking like a world airline while pawning assets to pay last month's fuel bill. The result was not a graceful landing. It was a stall. And when a giant stalls, it doesn't glide down alone. Because behind every logo are people, flight attendants who'd built entire lives around the promise that this company would always be there. Mechanics in Miami and New York whose skills were tailored to a single fleet. Communities in places like Berlin, Guam, and San Juan that treated the Pan Am timetable like a lifeline to the rest of the planet. When leadership refused to imagine a smaller Pan Am, they were quietly choosing a world where tens of thousands would find out, in one brutal decade, that their loyalty had an expiration date. Here's the moral tension. Pan Am made the world feel smaller and more connected. It carried refugees, students, soldiers, honeymooners. It turned what had been a journey for the ultra-rich into something a middle-class family could finally dream about. Yet inside the company, markets looked like territories to be captured, not communities to be stewarded. Routes were chess pieces. People were load factors. Let me take you back to that December night in 1991, the last 747's landing, crews in tears, passengers stepping off into airports that had already erased the name from departure boards. Ambition had built an airline that touched nearly every continent. The same ambition, unbounded and unquestioned, helped drive it into the ground when the world no longer matched its fantasies of endless demand. So the question hanging over Pan Am's ghost is simple. If this, at times inspiring and at times chilling, is what unrestrained ambition can do to a company and a country's image, what would a healthier kind of ambition look like? For a business? For a superpower? For a single human life planning its own ascent and, one day, its descent? So let me take you back to that image of Pan Am as America's flying empire, draped in glamour and national pride, and then remember how fast it turned into a ghost. That gap between image and outcome is the first lesson. Pan Am kept telling the world a story of endless demand, effortless prestige, inevitable growth. The logo still screamed power long after the balance sheet was whispering danger. Many lives work the same way. A title, a degree, a famous company on the resume becomes a costume that no longer matches the play. There was a time when being a Pan Am pilot or a Pan Am stewardess was enough to define a person. The brand carried them. Until it didn't. Because the fuel crisis hit, deregulation hit, terror hit, and the narrative never updated fast enough. It's an example of what happens when a story becomes a shield instead of a tool. The question for anyone watching is simple. What story about money, career, or family is being defended long after the facts have changed? Pan Am also built its life on single-point bets. One airline, one man's vision, one giant leap on the 707, then an even bigger leap on the 747. When it worked, the wealth and prestige were immense. When interest rates rose, fuel spiked, and competition flooded in, those same planes turned into flying anchors. Many careers look just as concentrated. One employer, one skill, one client, one relationship holding up the entire emotional economy. Optionality is boring until the storm hits. A second skill, a side project, a wider network, a little extra cash saved instead of spent on lifestyle upgrades. These look small compared to a giant blue globe on a tail fin, yet they are what keep a life from going bankrupt overnight. His story is one of concentration. The safer version is quiet diversification. Then there is timing. the silent killer. Pan Am was early to flying boats, early to jets, early to jumbo jets. Each move was visionary, and each one also landed just before the rules changed. New regulators, new competitors, new costs. Being right about the future of travel did not save it from being wrong about when and at what scale. The same is true for a business idea launched into the wrong economy, or a move to a hot city right as the rents peak. So this is the moment to audit your own Pan Am assumptions. Are promotions expected because of past status? Are old connections treated like permanent assets? Is a personal brand being mistaken for current performance? Prestige is a lagging indicator. The market, the boss, even the family can quietly reroute, while the story in your head still flies the old schedule. If your life or business were an airline, what routes are being flown just because they always have? And what would it look like to redraw your own map before someone else does it, abruptly, in the dark, with no return flight home? So let me take you back to that dark terminal on December 4th, 1991. The departure boards are thinning out. The blue globe logos are still glowing, but the counters are going quiet. Agents who spent a life turning passports into boarding passes are closing their drawers, handing in their badges, hanging those crisp Pan Am uniforms in the back room for the final time. Out on the ramp, the last flights are taxiing in, one by one, like an empire coming home without knowing the crown has already been taken. Now, mentally rewind the tape and lay it over that same night. There was a time when those uniforms stepped off flying boats in tropical lagoons, when the word clipper meant adventure, money, and power, all in one neat script on the nose of a seaplane. The same company that is now stapling termination notices once launched from Miami and San Francisco harbors, skimming waves toward Manila, Rio, and Auckland, turning oceans from barriers into corridors. Overlay another frame. The 707s roaring into the jet age, Pan Am crews walking out under sodium lights, jackets sharp, hats level, carrying the confidence of a country that assumed the future would always arrive on schedule. Juan Tripp's signature on that secret deal with Boeing is floating, ghost-like, over the December 4th memo from a bankruptcy judge. Same company, same logo, completely different altitude. Then the 747s appear in the mental montage, debuting at the Worldport at JFK, that UFO-shaped terminal flinging jet bridges like tentacles toward a brand new queen of the skies. Presidents and pop stars are stepping down those Pan Am stairs, cameras flashing, the airline acting as unofficial State Department, fashion runway, and propaganda film all at once. His story is one of ambition so large it needed wide-body aircraft just to contain it. Now snap back to that last night. No presidents, no champagne, just fluorescent lights, a court order, and a stack of memos. Operations ceased, assets transferred, employees released. For a company that once negotiated with dictators and moved armies, the ending is almost bureaucratic, like closing a file instead of burying a legend. It's an example of what happens when the scale of what is built far exceeds the ceremony of how it ends. Across this whole arc, the forces are all visible at once. Ruthless ambition and government partnership building a global flag carrier. Technology bets on jets and jumbos that magnified both wealth and risk. Deregulation, fuel shocks, terrorism, and brutal competition grinding away the margins. Culture and timing shifting under Pan Am's feet until glamour looked inefficient and the blue globe looked old. Seen from that December night, the story stops being just about airplanes. It becomes a lens, a way to notice how endings often arrive, not as explosions, but as signatures and silence. As you watch those last passengers walk off the jet bridge, The real question becomes, what other empires in your world are already taxiing to their final gate long before anyone announces the arrival? Because the takeaway from Pan Am isn't only how it died, it's what that death reveals about power, risk, and how to read the sky before the lights go out. Because the takeaway from Pan Am isn't only how it died, it's what that death reveals about power, risk, and how to read the sky before the lights go out. There was a time when one blue globe on a tail fin seemed permanent. In 1927, Pan American started as a risky little mail route to Havana, flying rickety planes over water most pilots avoided. Within a decade, it was launching flying boats across the Atlantic and Pacific, turning what had been a dangerous expedition into a floating salon for the ultra-wealthy. Champagne, silver service, white tablecloths, and a ticket price closer to a small house than a weekend trip. From there, the empire only grew. Juan Tripa's life became a story of relentless expansion, carving new routes, negotiating with presidents and dictators, lobbying Washington until Pan Am was effectively America's unofficial flag carrier. Then came the jet age. His secret bulk deal with Boeing on the 707 helped pull commercial aviation into a new era overnight, shrinking continents, reordering business, family, money, and power. When Pan Am became the launch customer for the 747, ordering dozens of giants at once, it was at times inspiring and at times chilling. The airline wasn't just betting on planes, it was betting on the future of globalization itself. But it's an example of what happens when ambition, technology, and national power align to build something extraordinary. And then the world changes faster than the institution can. Fuel crises hit. Deregulation unleashed low-cost competitors. Tourism patterns shifted, hub cities rose and fell, and that fleet of beautiful 747s turned into flying debt. A Lockerbie-sized crater opened in the brand. The slow-motion decline that followed looked less like a single mistake and more like a long refusal to accept that the game board had been rearranged. Because Pan Am's fall was not written in the stars. Other airlines adapted. Some even thrived. Its collapse was overdetermined by a chain of choices, doubling down on prestige when the market wanted cheap seats, clinging to political influence when policy winds shifted, loading up on debt when flexibility mattered more than size. Assumptions went unchallenged for too long, until one December night in 1991, when the world's airline quietly stopped being an airline at all. If that sounds familiar, it should. Today, the anxiety has just moved to different gates. Debates about American decline, fragile supply chains, tech monopolies, and industries that feel too big to fail live in the same neighborhood as Pan Am's story. Corporations that negotiate with governments, platforms that seem untouchable, brands that feel like infrastructure rather than companies. So let me take you back to that last jet bridge for a reason. Pan Am is a mental model, a way to spot when an empire confuses its past protection with future safety. As you watch the companies, institutions, and even personal plans shaping your own life, the question becomes, which ones are still climbing? And which ones are already on final approach, with everyone pretending the landing isn't coming? There was a time when Pan Am's logo on a ticket felt like a guarantee, a promise that the future would keep looking like the recent past. That feeling is everywhere today. In the apps on your phone, the universities on the brochure, the flag on the tail of the plane. So here is a simple way to see through the glamour. 3 questions. First, what assumptions is this empire built on? With Pan Am, it was endless demand for long-haul travel, cheap fuel, privileged routes, a world where America's power would always clear the skies. Second, How quickly are those assumptions changing? Jet fuel prices spiked, deregulation shattered cozy monopolies, foreign carriers rose, terrorism rewired public fear. Third, what is the exit strategy if they are wrong? Pan Am had almost none. No strong domestic network, no real hedges, just more debt, more wide bodies, more faith. Take that framework and hold it up to what runs your life now. The dominant airline in your country, promising loyalty, perks forever. The tech platform that insists its network is unbreakable. The university charging more each year while lectures quietly move online. Even the government that spends as if interest rates never rise. It's an example of what happens when story and reality drift apart, when the brochure keeps bragging as the balance sheet quietly bleeds. Let me take you back to your own career for a moment. Which part of Pan Am's story felt uncomfortably familiar? The leaders who only knew one era and just kept doubling down. The prestige brand that confused nostalgia for safety. The workers who saw the warning lights but hoped seniority would protect them. His story is one of empire and collapse, at times inspiring and at times chilling. But it is also a mirror. What is one small course correction you could make now? Learning a new skill instead of trusting the old job title. Diversifying clients instead of relying on one big contract. Moving some savings away from the glamorous but fragile bet. Because of its ruthless faith in growth, Pan Am never really planned its landing. Many modern giants are doing the same. That is why this channel doesn't just collect trivia about dead brands. It builds a mental library of patterns. If this story changed how you see the logos around you, consider subscribing or watching the other deep dives on rise and fall empires, from corporate dynasties to entire economies that flew too high on cheap money and national pride. On December nights now, somewhere over the Atlantic, another wide body lifts into the dark, cabin lights dimmed, engines humming. The last Pan Am jet disappeared into that same kind of sky, its blue globe fading to black. Every takeoff, corporate or personal, carries the same silent question. Not only how high will this fly, but when the fuel runs low, how will it land? But imagine, just for a moment, that December night ends differently. The judge signs a different order, the money shows up, and the blue globe gets one last chance to climb. In this alternate story, Pan Am crawls out of 1991 not as a glamorous empire, but as something leaner, almost unrecognizable. The transatlantic sprawl is cut back, the money-losing European mini-hub is gone, and the airline doubles down on a Latin American network it always understood better than most. Miami becomes less a layover and more a fortress. There was a time when Pan Am treated routes like trophies. In this world, every mile has to pay rent. Freed from trying to be everywhere, the company does something it once would have hated. It joins others. Instead of dying before the age of alliances, Pan Am becomes an early architect, trading absolute control for shared schedules, joint ventures, and someone else's feed traffic into New York and Miami. The proud loner that once negotiated with presidents now negotiates with other airlines, and, quietly, that saves its life. Then the next wave hits, September 11th, 2001. A brand that carried the Lockerbie scar now faces a world that suddenly fears the sky itself. In the real timeline, Pan Am is already a memory. Here, it is forced to confront every weakness at once. High international exposure, a name tied to hijackings and Cold War intrigue, a cost structure still heavier than the new low-fare predators. Yet the same long-haul expertise that once flew clippers across oceans lets it pivot faster on security, on new procedures, on reassuring a shaken public that the sky can be safe again. The 2008 financial crisis arrives like another fuel shock. A surviving Pan Am, now battle-hardened, cannot out-cheap the discounters, so it stops trying. The brand shifts from champagne fantasy to something colder but more durable. Reliability, global reach, a promise that if you have to cross the world for work, the Blue Globe will get you there. No drama. It becomes less a national flag carrier and more the quiet anchor of an alliance, or maybe a premium niche player on the thickest long-haul routes, selling time and predictability instead of caviar. Then, finally, COVID. Borders slam shut, wide bodies go into storage, and the entire industry flirts with the same death Pan Am met in 1991. Does this version make it through? That depends on what lessons it really learned. Because his story is one of ruthless adaptation, and at times inspiring, and at times chilling refusal to accept limits, Juan Trippe built a company that believed it could bend the world. It's an example of what happens when that belief never evolves. This thought experiment isn't about nostalgia. It is about contingency. Institutions are not fated to die on a particular night. They live or die by how they answer pressure, how they change their habits, how they let go of their own myths. So let me take you back to that question every takeoff carries. How high could Pan Am have flown if it had survived its first crash with reality? And what new dangers would have waited in the thinner air above? Hold that in mind, because the next part of this story asks something even harder: what its fall reveals about the rise and possible fall of American power itself. So let me take you back to that terminal one last time. The crowds are gone now. The departure boards are dark. Sunlight cuts through the dusty glass of a Worldport-style roof, landing in long, empty rectangles on cracked terrazzo. Jetways sit frozen in mid-gesture, reaching for planes that will never nose up to them again. Faded blue globes cling to the walls, their once bright oceans now the color of old denim, watching over gates that no longer call anyone home. There was a time when this place was the center of an empire. When Pan Am mail planes hopped jungle strips in Latin America, when flying boats skimmed across the Pacific and turned oceans into runways, when a boarding pass here meant entry into a smaller, faster world. From Clippers to 707s to the first 747s, 64 years of shrinking distance, of turning maps from mysteries into timetables, are now compressed into dust motes drifting in a shaft of light. His story is one of ambition written in contrails and balance sheets, and this building is what's left of it. The beauty is still visible if you squint. The sweep of the roof, the optimism of the glass, the promise that money and engineering could conquer any horizon. But so is the arrogance, the assumption that fuel would stay cheap, that debt would stay friendly, that power would stay American. It's an example of what happens when an airline believes it is too iconic to fail, right up until the night the lights go out. Walk those abandoned corridors, and the mixed legacy hangs in the air heavier than jet fuel. Pan Am connected families across wars and continents, flew refugees and rock stars, diplomats and tourists, the hopeful and the haunted. It also rode cozy deals with governments, ignored looming costs, and treated the planet and its people as variables in a grand equation of growth. For the men and women who wore the uniform, this wasn't just a company. It was a life. Pride in the wings on their chest, pain when the paychecks bounced, a blue globe on the tail, then a cardboard box on the way out. Every era has its Pan Ams, symbols that feel permanent, that define what wealth and progress look like, until one day the logo is all that's left on a forgotten sign. Railroads, radio networks, oil empires, airlines that once negotiated with presidents now survive as museum exhibits, retro t-shirts, and half-remembered boarding calls. Listen closely in this empty terminal. Under the hum of fluorescent lights, there's a faint echo. A boarding announcement, mangled by distance, the rising whine of a 747 spool-up, the murmur of 100 languages blending into one shared impatience to leave the ground. Then, slowly, even that fades. The engines wind down. The speakers click off. Silence taxis up to the gate. On the screen, the worldport dissolves into black, and a new set of destinations appears. Another story of power, ambition, and collapse is waiting. Choose your next flight.